with the UC Irvine Economic Self-Sufficiency Policy Research Institute, also known as ESPRI. Professor Jenkins is an assistant professor at the UC Irvine School of Education. Prior to her faculty appointment, she served as the IES postdoctoral fellow at the UC Irvine School of Education. Professor Jenkins received her BS and MS degrees from the University of Florida, and her PhD is from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research interests are in early childhood development, child and family policy, policy analysis, and program evaluations. Much of her work focuses on educational and social policy interventions that promote child and family well-being and the reduction of poverty in the long term. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jenkins for her talk on state-level investments in early childhood education, evidence of short and long-term impacts. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to see a full room. When I came in earlier, I thought, all right, there'll be a lot of empty seats, but no. People are engaged and interested, so I'm very excited. So one of my key research interests is in state early childhood policy. So I've got the first part of my talk is about state policy, and then I'll get into a specific research project on state investments that's funded by ESPRI, the center that Cindy mentioned earlier. And also, please feel free to interrupt me with any questions, clarifying questions throughout, and other broader questions happy to take at the end. So for a lot of reasons, when we think about state early childhood policy, it's a very exciting time, right? Why is it so exciting? Well, we've got an explosion of research on the importance of early childhood development and education over the past 20, 30 years, just tons of research. Some of the most notable research that maybe some of you are familiar with come from long-run evaluations of the Perry Preschool program and the Abecedarian Early Childhood Intervention Project. And this is the kind of, this is some of the groundbreaking work that really kind of cleared the pathway for all of the research we have today. So what happened in these seminal studies is that they randomly assigned children to have an intensive early childhood education program, very disadvantaged kids, randomly assigned some to get the intervention and control group kids to not get the intervention. We love random assignment studies because they give us great causal estimates, right? So we have this great causal work about the benefits of these programs that started in the 60s and 70s. Some of them are summarized on this graph here, where not only did kids do better in school, but as an adult, they were more likely to earn more money, own their home, less likely to be on welfare, more likely to complete college and have a skilled job. So what we've seen from some of these early landmark studies is that investments in early childhood education pay off in the short and long run. But these were small, intensive, random assignment studies for very, very disadvantaged kids. And so I'll get back to that in a minute. And so what this has fueled are huge investments at the federal and state level. California invests almost $5 billion in early childhood education in the latest budget. At the federal level, it's a little over $20 billion. And in recent years, these investments have come in the form of large expansions in pre-kindergarten programs, so state-level programs for children aged 4, so right before they enter the year before kindergarten. But so while all of this is very exciting, early childhood policy is also a big mess. And you're going to be like, but this is your area. Shouldn't you be cleaning it up? I'm working on it. Let's see, why is it such a mess? So why? Why so messy? Mess number one that I think is relevant for this audience here today is that the governance of early childhood education at the state level is complicated, as is the funding. And so what does this mean? For those of you that are DOE people here today, I know there was a crisis, so might not be as many of them, but so for those of you familiar, early childhood education is dispersed. The responsibility for the administration, funding, and general oversight of of early childhood programs are dispersed across multiple state agencies. So it is not the case that you have preschool and DOE is responsible and funds preschool, and it all happens in one agency. The responsibility for subsidized childcare, pre-K, early intervention, all of these programs that target families with young children are housed in many different state-level government agencies. Also at the federal level, this is not unique to states. But so this responsibility is dispersed. All these different agencies are responsible for different aspects of these policies. And scholars and reasonable, regular people that engage in these systems, like parents, find it to be haphazard, idiosyncratic, and incoherent. And so some of the top scholars in the field say this is a complete mess. One quote I like is, "The haphazard funding, monitoring, and programmatic organization and infrastructure supporting efforts to foster young children's developmental competencies in various settings undermines the capacity to deliver on that promise." So there is a general feeling in the early childhood field that this mess of governance is impeding upon our ability to use policy to improve child development. And just to give you a concrete example, this is from the Learning Policy Institute. It is an illustration of California's system for early childhood education. It traces federal money, state money, all the way down to where we think the money goes, which is to caring for kids, right? And I know the lines, it's kind of like set up in a little bit of a dramatic way, but what this illustration points out is that this is not a straightforward system. Early childhood policy evolved over time from many different piecemeal funding policies and programs from different federal government agencies. It was never a comprehensive system to begin with in this country. And so this has evolved into what we see today, which is things go through many different state level agencies, pass through local organizations, municipal organizations sometimes, all before it gets to centers that actually serve kids. Now, California is not alone. This is just one concrete example, but in all across the country, ECE is dispersed in governed in many different ways. So this is from a report by the Bipartisan Policy Center that's really tracing this idea of governance messiness in early childhood education. This color-coded map is the agency in each state that governs the most number of programs. So in California, it is the DOE, but in many different states, it's like all over the place. Texas, there's like 8 or 9 different state agencies responsible for all the programs targeted at young children. So right now, every state system does early childhood education differently. And how does this affect kids? We don't really know, because there's very limited research on how the setup of policies and administration, how our institutions trickle down into our ability to cultivate development through policy. And so we don't know a whole lot about it, but what we hypothesize is that this disorganization is hindering the synergy of state policies. We're not creating alignment and coordination across these programs, and we're not using our resources and institutions to optimize programs for kids. I've done some work in this area, a study I did looking at how much this dispersion might trickle down to affect kids' outcomes. And what we found is that if you've got a few agencies, you can improve kids' outcomes because you can coordinate across maybe 2 or 3 agencies. But once you get to 6, 7, 8, it's not a good system that doesn't promote coordination and alignment. But when you have this single organization, as I think it's on this map, as Georgia, and I think Oregon has it, a single organization doesn't mean you've got it all aligned. You could be a master of nothing, right? So what is that balance between coordination and specialization? We don't know. So this is an area as early childhood education is expanding rapidly at the state level, we don't have a good grasp on how we best set up state systems to best serve children. And so, not surprisingly, there's a large call for better coordination and alignment at the state and federal levels. And this is actually an explicit component of the preschool development grants that just came out that California has now, and the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grants. So essentially, this is an area that I think we'll need to learn a lot more about, but right now it's kind of just a mess. All right, so now a little bit more related to my talk today. What is mess number 2? And I would say this is related back to the peri-preschool and abecedarian findings that I showed you earlier. That when we think about what it means to have scaled up policy population level preschool, it is not the same thing as small randomized studies of intensive early childhood programs for very disadvantaged kids. So this is a map from a really good research synthesis by Deborah Phillips and a bunch of top scholars in the field about the impacts of early childhood education programs. And what we see here, this indicates the evaluations of state pre-K programs in the short, medium, and long term. And you've kind of got varying levels of evidence-based research across the states. And every state does their governance differently. They do their pre-K program differently. Everything's different. So we're limited on how much we know about pre-K in the long run. And what we do know isn't so promising. So this is from a different report by the Learning Policy Institute that summarized the evidence of effectiveness of state pre-K programs. And what we see here, this is the table in the report that says, what do we know about it when kids get older? So 7th grade, 8th grade as adults. And this summary at the bottom is saying how many of these studies of state pre-K programs show that that kids that went to preschool did better. A couple, but a lot of them, 7 out of this 10 right here, show the outcomes are the same. So what we know in the short run is that pre-K program does a good job. At the end of the year, kids are improved, have improved outcomes based on some comparison condition. But when we're looking outward, we don't know a whole lot. We don't have strong evidence of what it means when we have a scaled up population level early childhood education program. How much can we expect in the long run? And so this is really a key question for the field. What can we expect from state level investments in early childhood education? Really thinking closely about preschool programs. And this is really the question at the core of the study I'm going to share with you today that's funded by ESPRI and the Spencer Foundation, which is looking at the impacts of state mandates for kindergarten attendance as evidence of early childhood education, of long-run impacts of early childhood education. So why do I think this is informative for state legislators, policy researchers, and for the people in the early childhood education field? Well, as I've told you, we've seen these rapid expansions in pre-K programs. And to be specific, what are pre-K programs? They are voluntary or part-time educational programs that occur not really in schools. Most of them occur in, are through third-party delivery systems in private, public, for-profit organizations, community-based organizations. So they occur in a variety of settings. Oftentimes they're targeted towards low-income kids, but a lot more programs are universal and more states are moving towards universal access. And as I said, we've got good short-term evidence, but not a whole lot of long-term evidence on these programs. And that what we're seeing in pre-K expansion and access really mirrors the origins of what kindergarten once was. So kindergarten began in the 19th century when German immigrants brought this model over to the U.S., and I think the first program was like in Indiana, And where did it occur? These programs were in private, community-based organizations, at churches. They were not in the public school to begin with. But gradually over time, by the kind of early 20th century to the mid-20th century, kindergarten programs were fully kind of engulfed by public schools, by the K-12 system. And now we think, oh, of course, we think of it as the K-12 system. But it wasn't always that. So this is kind of why we think, all right, well, if people think we're moving towards a pre-K-12 system, maybe this research on this area of kindergarten could be informative. And so what we are taking advantage of in this study is that over time, some states evolve towards creating compulsory kindergarten attendance. And so this means that in most states, actually, kindergarten is voluntary, right? That compulsory schooling really only begins at age 6 and 7. But in some states, they changed compulsory schooling to begin at age 5 when children are first eligible for kindergarten. So what we're doing in this study is taking advantage of the fact of that states change their policies over time. Some states changed, specifically 13 states adopted mandatory kindergarten between 1970 and 2000. And this shift in the minimum school entry age gives us an idea of what it might mean at a population level if we expand early childhood education by a year, during early life, where we think where we know that educational impacts are most important. And so we are going to leverage these changes over time in state policies to examine the effects of state mandatory kindergarten requirements on long-run outcomes. So we can observe people that were subjected to these policies at kindergarten and find them as adults in the census, the ACS, which is what we'll do, and see how they're doing in terms of income and education and things like that. And for those of you that are familiar with the early childhood education literature or policy analysis literature, as I was discussing with the UCCS scholars this morning, is that we know that early childhood education is more, or that there's stronger impacts for certain subgroups of kids. So we know that the impacts of Head Start and preschool are more important, are stronger for children from low-income families, children from non-white children who are non-English speaking, from families in low-income communities. So what we'll be doing is looking at how the impact of early childhood education varies across key subpopulations as well. Okay, so the contributions in terms of the literature are, there's a lot of research in economics on different components of these topics and in many other areas. So as I kind of have suggested with the Perry-preschool comparison, we know a good amount about long-run outcomes from kids that got an intensive program and that was from a small sample. But we are really contributing in that we're looking at this at-scale kind of low-intensity intervention, kindergarten. We're looking at something that's at scale at the policy level, and we're able to look at heterogeneity because we'll have a large sample. We can break the population up into bins, into groups, and have enough of a sample to estimate long-run outcomes for them. This is different from some of the other literature, looking at the impacts of, people look at this like age within cohort. I don't know if anybody's familiar with some of this work, but it's like if you start kindergarten and you're 5.2 versus 5.3, do you do better at the end of the year? And I kind of am like, who cares? But there's a big whole group of people that really care about that. So we're doing something different than that. We're looking at the impact of kindergarten wholesale. There's a couple of studies that have looked at the impacts of kindergarten expansion grants. So not mandates, but have how different grants that expanded access to kindergarten have affected individuals. So it's a little different than that. And some other work has looked at compulsory schooling, the impacts of changing the school exit laws, but that's really estimating the impact of an extra year of education in adolescence. And what we'll be doing is looking at it during early childhood when we think that educational investments or inputs are even more impactful or have a larger payoff, right? And so to connect to this last point, this is because you might say, well, Jade, everybody goes to kindergarten. I didn't know it was mandatory, but we're going anyway. Well, you may well think that, and you're all educated, engaged people in this room, but for many reasons, people might not choose to go to kindergarten unless they have to. So what this information from the National Center for Education, oh, you really got to get in this microphone, yeah. The National Center for Education statistics is enrollment rates in school by age groups. So what you can see is that when compulsory schooling, when we think about it at age 7, it's pretty close to 100% enrollment. But this gap in enrollment in schooling, not just public schooling, between ages 5 and 6 and 7 to 13, that's what we're leveraging. The fact that not everybody does enroll in kindergarten if they don't have to. But when compulsory schooling starts at age 6, closer to 100% of people go. And this is comparing that at the other end of the age spectrum at school exit laws. Pretty much close to 100% of kids are enrolled at ages 14 and 15, but as school exit laws differ, at 16 and 17, you can legally drop out. Okay, so how am I going to convince you that I have some data that can answer this question? That's what you should be wondering, and that's what I'm going to tell you. So first, I'm going to answer this question. Did these mandates affect whether or not kids enrolled in kindergarten, right? There's no way that we can see the impact of this policy on long-run outcomes if it didn't actually impact people enrolling in kindergarten. So first, I'm going to show you that it did, to give away the first part of the answer. So what are we going to do to measure this? Well, first, we did the very difficult work of collecting state kindergarten mandates for every state every year since 1970. I know, right? So anybody, all you guys interested in engaging in research, like this is some of the stuff you're going to do. So we coded up every state, every statute, or my graduate student, sorry, that's what'll happen when you go to grad school. Every state mandate for every year. And so just to give you an example, it's like going through the state legislature website, and looking at specific language about whether or not kids have to go to kindergarten at age 5 or if the compulsory schooling starts at age 6 or 7. So that took a while. Yeah, and then what do we need to do? We need to look at enrollment rates. So state by year mandates, state by year enrollment rates, and thankfully the Digest of Education Statistics has this, so we can see that's our outcome variable in this first regression. Okay, did these mandates affect these enrollment rates? And we're also going to control for a number of factors that change in states over time. The population, how much they spend on schooling, at what age what is the school entry cutoff for, do you have to enter kindergarten by September 1 or by December 1? So controlling for these kindergarten entry cutoffs and a bunch of other stuff about states. And the research design model that we're using is a state fixed effect model, which you don't have to be econometric-y to understand, is basically we look at every state over time, and you use the state as their own control. So I have a measure of what happened in the state before they changed the policy, what happened in the state after the policy, and I do that for every state over time, and that gives me a really good measure of the impact of the policy because I can control for what was happening before, and I can reduce the bias from any unobserved factors about that state. So I'm happy to talk with you more about the details, but basically our research design is able to eliminate bias from state factors that could otherwise contribute to these kinds of outcomes that we're interested in. So this research design, we're going to control for stuff that changes over time, and we're going to look at whether or not these mandates influenced kindergarten enrollment rates. So, did they? Yes, they did. So as a result of the mandates, kindergarten enrollment increased by 8.5 percentage points. And this is about 10% of the mean. We saw about an 85% enrollment overall across the country. And so these mandates, yes, when a state implemented this policy, enrollment went up, and on average, this went up by 8.5 percentage points in that state. So, okay, now that I answered this kind of base question, because there's no way we can influence your outcomes without you attending kindergarten. So this mechanism, we've done a good check on the mechanism. So now I want to answer, did these mandates influence long-run outcomes, right? That's what we want to know. Does early childhood education influence long-run outcomes? And so the data we're leveraging here come from the American Community Survey, which is a large population-level representative survey of adults living in the U.S. It's got very detailed information on where you work, what you do, your education, all of these things. And so key to what we need to know is that it tells you where you were born. So we are assuming that where the state you were born is the state where you went to kindergarten. We do some checks. Seems okay. But so that's how we are assigning individuals to exposure to mandatory kindergarten. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So basically, we took everybody that was born between 65 and 90, so they would have attended kindergarten between 1970 and 1995. And so we observed them as adults in the ACS. And then we take their, I'll tell you that in a minute, we take their state of birth and the time of year that they were born to assign them to kindergarten mandates. So if you were born in a year that kindergarten became mandatory, you become exposed to that policy. You're like our treatment group. And if you were born in a year that those mandates were not happening, you're like in our control group. And some kids that live in certain states that never adopted the policy, they're never exposed. They're part of the control group as well. So why is this important here? We are right now in the restricted data center. Anybody heard of these? The census restricted data centers? They are like a big black box. It takes a year or two to get access. I have special sworn status by the Census Bureau. It's a whole thing. But we are in the process of using the restricted use data to update these results because we would really like to have not quarter of birth. We really want date of birth. Why? Because, as you know, kindergarten birth date cutoffs assign you by month, right? So we could misassign people to exposure to mandatory kindergarten based on the time of year in which you were born. So right now, what I'm going to show you today is based on assigning people to treatment to mandatory kindergarten based on quarter of birth. But we really are excited to get these restricted use data so that we can more precisely assign people to treatment. The problem is you need to send these data to Washington. It takes a month just to get disclosure review. And so anyway, we are in the process of doing that, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. But we're basically replicating this in data where we have a little more precision. The outcomes I'm going to show you today are educational attainment, earnings, and poverty status. And so basically this research design, it's the same thing as what I was telling you about before. We've got people in states over time that are or are not exposed to mandatory kindergarten. We're going to control for a whole bunch of things that change over time about states. We're going to control for a bunch of things about individuals, like their age, their sex, race, ethnicity. And we are going to include, we're using the state fixed effect model that basically wipes out any other weird unobserved thing about a state that could confound or bias the relationship that we're interested in. So this quasi-experimental design is really helping us isolate the impact of the mandates on individual outcomes. So now, results. Okay. First, I'm going to show you overall results for the whole population. So, did mandatory kindergarten affect long-run outcomes for individuals that were exposed to this policy? And the answer is somewhat. So, this policy, based on our public use results, increased degree attainment by 1.4 percentage points. This is the only regression table. Everything else is figures, but I just kept one because there's not a whole lot going on in this table. So the only significant impact is on associate's or BA degree. So if you are exposed to this policy, if you lived in one of these states, we see at a population level that degree attainment increased by 1.4 percentage points. And so that's not maybe so impressive, but at the same time, this is a universal intervention. So finding some kind of traction on this policy, we think is important. However, the story really changes when we look at this key component of policy analysis, as I mentioned, heterogeneity. So when we break out the impacts of this policy by race, and ethnicity, we see some pretty impressive differences. So the benefits of mandatory kindergarten seem to be most largest for non-white individuals. So for Hispanic children exposed to the policy, we see huge impacts on high school degree, college enrollment, as well as income. Income, this is a percentage boost, so it boosted incomes of Hispanic individuals by nearly 20%. This is from our public use estimates, so we still want to make sure we've got it very precise when we use our restricted use data, but we're seeing some pretty substantial impacts here. Poverty reduction strongest for Hispanic individuals as well. We also see some benefits of improvements to college enrollment by Black individuals, and as well as benefits for total income. So even though the overall story wasn't as strong, what we see, and this is very much in line with what we know about early childhood education, that the impacts were concentrated for non-white individuals exposed to the policy. For sex, we see not as dramatic a story, but still important heterogeneity, that this women exposed to, or they were girls, I guess, when they were kids, right? But females exposed to mandatory kindergarten policies increased high school degree attainment, enrollment in college, and increased their income by 6%. So we're seeing that for individuals who are, we know that there are pay gaps and key education gaps, that this policy impact, the policy impacts were strongest for these groups. So again, you should say, well, I don't believe you. What convince me? Do a better job. And I would say, I'm working on it. And we're doing that. So what other robustness checks have we done? We've done a bunch of things that I'm happy to go into detail more on, but for the sake of time, just listing them here. We looked at whether or not the states that adopted these policies, was something weird going on in these states prior to adoption. Did they, their education was really in the tank, and so then they adopted this policy. What else could be explaining these findings that isn't mandatory kindergarten? And we find that there's no differences in these states prior to adoption, these other characteristics about states. Again, I said we assume where you were born is where you went to kindergarten, and we've done some checks to look at migration during early childhood, and it doesn't look like there are these large differences in migration in mandatory versus non-mandatory states. We've looked at what you could consider compliers, so people enrolled as a result of these mandates, but who enrolled? What individuals, what types of families were more likely to listen to the mandates in these, who were the people driving these increases in enrollment? And what we find are that Hispanic families were more likely to enroll in kindergarten as a result of the policy. And so were families with lower levels of education, which again is in line with what we know about early childhood education. these are the families that are benefiting more from the program, and they were more likely to enroll. And it doesn't look like that moms changed what they were doing as a result of these policies. So was this, they got a boost in childcare essentially? Did this change how much money they made and things like that? And we don't see a whole lot of parents changing, moms changing employment at all. So what we're doing right now is looking at more heterogeneous impacts. As I said, what's really important is looking at these other neighborhood characteristics. So we are going to be linking it with, this restricted data allows us to get individuals' county of birth, so we can match the kind of neighborhood resources that were available to individuals at the time. Because what we know about early childhood education is if you don't have a lot going on, if you live in a isolated rural area or in an area with low levels of education, this could have been particularly impactful for your community. We're going to do some other checks that basically, well, they're called falsification tests, which basically say, well, what if what if we pretend assigned this policy? What if we made fake data and ran your same regression? Would we see the same result? Basically a test of like, is what we find just noise, statistical noise? And so we're working on that. We're going to do more, looking more at the pre-trends and try and collect more state covariates, but there's not a whole lot available once you get into the 60s and 70s. It's kind of a dark data time. So just to conclude, what we see from this study is that families did respond to these kindergarten mandates, particularly Hispanic families and those with lower, the household heads with lower levels of educational attainment. We see some suggestive main overall effects of mandatory kindergarten, but that these long-run impacts of mandatory kindergarten as early childhood education are most concentrated for Hispanic families and for females. So to conclude, it does seem like states' investments in early childhood education pay off in the long run and can be equity enhancing, right? We know that the largest education and pay gaps are for students of color and for women, and so to the extent that early childhood education can address that, we're seeing some evidence here. And the heterogeneity, these kind of impacts and variations by racial and ethnic subgroups and by sex are similar to some other quasi-experimental studies on early childhood education. So we think what we're finding isn't totally unreasonable. And so with that, it's exactly 12:45, doing it. So I just want to thank you so much for